I'm here today to introduce the reading pack on taxation, governance, and growth. And to get started, I think it's useful to contextualize our new interest in taxation and governance within the broader debate about tax and development that has prevailed for several decades. That debate on tax and development has tended to focus on two broad questions. First, how can tax systems most efficiently and equitably raise revenue? And second, how can tax systems be designed to support economic growth? A third question has been added to that group only recently and has really only taken root over the past decade. How can taxation be designed in a way that contributes to broader improvements in governance, and particularly in state capacity and accountability? This third possibility has been critical to expanded international support for taxation over the past decade, and is also pivotal to any developmental agenda. Simply put, if taxation isn't translated into accountability, responsiveness, and improved government performance, the case for strengthening taxation in environments of weak governance is not terribly persuasive. Given this growing interest in the connections between taxation and governance, policymakers and practitioners are really confronted with three big new questions that they need to grapple with. First, is it in fact the case that expanded taxation can drive improved governance? Second, if it is, how exactly does this happen in practice? And third, insofar as we know how these processes happen, what can policymakers do to promote improved outcomes in practice? Beginning with the first question, does this happen in practice? Research has highlighted three broad ways through which taxation might be linked to improvements in governance. First are common interest processes. Governments that depend on tax revenue have an incentive to promote economic growth as a route to increasing revenue over the longer term. Second, state apparatus processes. The need to raise taxes is complex, and efforts to strengthen tax administration can therefore spill over to other areas of public administration, thus strengthening state capacity. And third, accountability and responsiveness processes. The need to raise taxes creates incentives for governments to be responsive and accountable to citizens in order to encourage tax compliance, while spurring taxpayers to make greater demands on governments for reciprocity. But while these theoretical predictions are clear, in each area the key message from empirical research is the same. While these positive synergies between tax and governance are possible, they are far from guaranteed. As such, the key challenge for policymakers and practitioners is to begin to understand how exactly these positive connections emerge in practice, and thus to understand how they can actively attempt to promote positive gains. So what then do we know about how exactly tax has been related to improvements in governance in practice? We can think first about the connections between tax and state building, and here we see three broad ways in which taxation has spurred improvements in state capacity. The first are demonstration effects. Tax agencies pioneer new processes which are later adopted elsewhere in government. That is, the tax agency is the leading edge of bureaucratic modernization. The second are spillover effects. Because improving taxation requires parallel improvements elsewhere in government, the incentives to strengthen tax agencies can become an incentive to drag other parts of the public apparatus towards improved performance as well. And finally are information sharing effects. Tax data can be critical input to broader economic and social policymaking, while data from other areas of government is important to strengthening tax collection. And that sharing of data can thus yield reciprocal gains. Turning to the connections between tax and accountability, we similarly have an increasingly sophisticated understanding of what those links look like in practice. And the key message here is again one of complexity. The term tax bargaining, for many people, evokes an image of a relatively explicit negotiation or exchange between taxpayers and governments, in which the one pays new taxes and the other delivers improved services. However, the reality on the ground is often significantly more complex. While certainly we see explicit forms of bargaining, this tends to occur more implicitly. Governments and taxpayers come into conflict, disagree, fight, but eventually each side compromises to some extent. But there are also even more complex processes through which tax may shape the extent of accountability. In some cases, governments may be unwilling to make compromises to citizens, and citizens may respond by refusing to pay taxes and aggressively avoiding. But in this way, they may reduce the fiscal capacity of states and hasten longer-term change. So resistance to taxation can be part of political bargaining. In the same way, new taxes can sometimes spur the creation of new civil society organizations, and those organizations can then play a key longer-term role in spurring improved accountability and responsiveness. So if we have then a picture of how taxation can be linked to state building and accountability, the key question for policymakers and practitioners is what they can do to strengthen those links concretely. Again, turning first to taxation and state building, we can see three broad messages that emerge. The first is to build stronger links between tax agencies and related branches of government, including at the central and local levels, in order to facilitate the kinds of demonstration effects and spillover effects that we know are possible. We often think about tax reform in silos, limited to tax agencies, but because of the complexity of taxation and the potential for broader gains, broadening our view to be more inclusive holds the potential to spur governance forward. Second is emphasizing in particular the importance of data sharing across government. Data sharing holds vast potential, but is also very infrequently practiced within existing governments in the developing world. And indeed, this is an easy reform to implement from a technical perspective. And finally, is emphasizing bureaucratic reforms that can be replicated elsewhere in government. Again, there's been a tendency to treat tax agencies as entirely unique and to pursue reform in isolation. But where reform of the tax agency is linked to broader reform programs, the potential for broader gains is amplified. Turning to the connections between tax and accountability, again, there are clear messages for policymakers and practitioners. The first is the importance of emphasizing efforts to strengthen the political salience of taxation. That is, helping citizens to understand what they pay and why they pay it. This can be done through an emphasis on direct taxes on income and property, which are particularly visible, but can also be achieved through greater transparency and through public education efforts by government or civil society to engage the public with tax debates. A second goal is to emphasize the importance of horizontal equity in tax enforcement. That is, ensuring that everyone is treated the same under the law. When citizens are treated in differential ways, that undermines collective action, because individual taxpayers seek to avoid, evade, and bargain their way out of taxes. But when everyone is treated the same way under the law, there are much stronger incentives for taxpayers to come together collectively and demand reciprocal benefits for governments, and this is often particularly important for business associations. Third, we can try to expand transparency around the connections between taxation and budgeting, because when citizens can understand the connections between taxes and public spending, they're both better able to engage and make reciprocal demands, and we're more able to see the construction of new forms of trust between governments and taxpayers when those links can be seen clearly and are developed further. In areas of particularly low trust, some forms of limited tax earmarking might also be useful, drawing explicit connections between particular taxes and particular expenditures that citizens can see and demand from government. Finally, there's scope for policymakers, including donors, to directly support popular engagement, including the creation of inclusive institutional spaces for tax bargaining, in order to facilitate engagement by taxpayers with the government, but also support directly for business associations, civil society organizations, and the media, who can act as intermediaries in linking citizens to tax debates. Finally, of course, although we now have a picture of what policy options are available, there remain important challenges to implementing them in practice. And I would mention two big questions in particular that need to be navigated at the local level as donors think about how to push these agendas forward. The first is about what the right approach is in mediating between the demands of traditional approaches to taxation, focused on revenue and growth, and more governance-focused approaches, focused on strengthening state capacity and accountability. In many cases, these two agendas are closely aligned and merely reinforce each other. but there are going to be cases where they may be in tension. And individual policymakers and practitioners will have to navigate where priorities should lie and where the greatest opportunities exist. The second big question relates to how these reform processes can be pursued in environments of weak governance, where political interests may be opposed to interagency cooperation and to tax reform that spurs broader public engagement. To state the relatively obvious, an unaccountable government is unlikely to support tax reform that's objective is specifically to encourage greater accountability. But of course, that's where reformers come in and try to push this agenda forward. And I think three messages from the broader literature on public sector reform are particularly relevant here. The first is to work from the government side, but also from the society side, bringing pressure from both sides to encourage more transparent and inclusive approaches to tax reform. The second is to try to identify and work with allies within the tax administration. Despite their sometimes bad reputation, many tax reformers have a very strong interest in seeing tax revenues used much more effectively, in part because that makes their job much easier. Finding allies can be key to pushing forward reform. And finally, donors have an opportunity to continuously emphasize the importance of these soft aspects of reform, focused on process, transparency, and inclusion, and then to seize windows of opportunity for advancing that agenda. Ultimately, we have an increasingly sophisticated understanding of the ways in which tax can be a spur to improvements in governance. But it's also essential to resist the temptation to think that this is automatic, but instead to focus on specific concrete ways that policymakers and practitioners can try to push forward those positive connections and thus make taxation a spur to broader improvements in governance and development outcomes.